Valdez, Alaska, winter of 2007, was not defined by cold. It was defined by weight, the kind of weight that doesn't scream when it arrives, but settles slowly, day after day, until buildings begin to fail without warning. By mid-December, snowbanks had already climbed higher than truck hoods. Roof lines disappeared, streets narrowed into white corridors where sunlight barely reached the ground. Every forecast sounded the same: more snow, no break, no melt. Valdez had seen heavy winters before, but this one kept coming, piling layer upon layer until the town felt pressed down into the earth. At first, people did what they always did. They shoveled. They climbed onto roofs in shifts, knocking snow loose before it hardened. They listened for creaks at night, the low, stretching sounds that meant beams were bending under too much load. Then, the collapses started. A warehouse roof caved in on Harbor Drive. A small apartment building sagged and had to be evacuated in the dark. Emergency sirens echoed through the snow as crews moved from call to call, marking structures unsafe, urging people to leave before the next storm buried them completely. By January, Valdez had received more snow than many towns see in several years combined. Some estimates passed 140 inches, and it was still falling. City officials stopped talking about inconvenience and started talking about danger. This wasn't about staying warm anymore. It was about roofs failing in the middle of the night, about houses turning into traps under tons of wet, compacted snow. Evacuation advisories went out. Schools closed indefinitely. Entire neighborhoods thinned as families packed up and left, choosing uncertainty on the road over certainty beneath their own roofs. In the middle of that slow exodus was a house most people didn't look at twice. Modest, wood-framed, nothing special on paper. It belonged to a man named Evan Holt, a former carpenter who had lived in Valdez long enough to respect snow but not fear it. While his neighbors loaded vehicles and cleared driveways for the last time, Evan stood in his yard, looking up, not at the sky, but at the angles of his roof. He wasn't measuring how much snow was on it. He was thinking about where it wanted to go. When the evacuation trucks came through his street, Evan didn't follow them. He didn't argue, he didn't explain. He went inside, gathered tools most people would have packed away for spring, and stepped back out into the storm. Snow fell thick and steady, muting sound, turning the world quiet and heavy. From a distance, it looked like he was making a mistake, staying when others left, working when others waited. But Evan wasn't trying to fight the winter. He was preparing to let it finish what it had already started. Evan Holt didn't see snow as something to be removed. He saw it as something that needed direction. Years before the winter of 2007, long before Valdez vanished under record snowfall, he had learned that most houses failed, not because they were weak, but because they were built to resist snow instead of cooperate with it. Flat sections, shallow pitches, sharp edges, places where weight collected and stayed. In heavy snow country, those were mistakes, and mistakes didn't announce themselves until it was too late. Evan had worked as a carpenter most of his adult life, repairing roofs after storms, reinforcing beams that had already begun to sag. He'd seen the same pattern again and again. Homes designed for moderate winters were quietly pushed past their limits when snowfall didn't stop. Clearing helped, but only temporarily. Snow came back heavier, wetter, compacted by wind and time. Every shovel load bought hours, not safety. That winter, as roofs failed across Valdez, Evan understood something most people didn't want to hear. There was no amount of clearing that would win this fight. So instead of shoveling endlessly, he started rebuilding, not from the inside and not all at once. Piece by piece, between storms, he changed the way his house met the snow. He steepened sections of the roof where weight lingered. He added temporary framing to redirect load toward walls designed to carry it. Where snow wanted to sit, he gave it a path to slide. Where it needed to stay, he let it settle evenly. The work was slow and methodical, done in freezing daylight and blowing snow. Every change was measured, not rushed. Neighbors noticed. Some shook their heads. Others warned him he was making things worse. City officials stopped by once, telling him evacuation orders were still in effect. Evan listened, nodded, and kept working. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was buying time, shaping the house so it could carry what was coming next. By then, snow depths in parts of town were already pushing 10 feet, with more in the forecast. Power flickered. Roads narrowed further. The town felt smaller every day. As night fell, Evan climbed down from the roof and stood back, studying the shape he'd created. The house no longer looked normal. Snow slid where it hadn't before, shedding in slow, heavy sheets, instead of building into dangerous slabs. Other areas disappeared under white, but evenly, quietly. Inside, the air stayed calm. The walls didn't creak. Nothing groaned under pressure. While Valdez prepared to abandon itself to the winter, Evan was doing something far stranger. He was letting the snow finish the job, trusting that if the house was shaped right, it wouldn't break when the next storm arrived. The third storm was the one that changed everything. By the time it arrived, Valdez was already exhausted. Streets had narrowed to single lanes carved between walls of snow. Heavy equipment worked around the clock, not to clear the town, but to keep it from disappearing entirely. Forecasts stopped giving totals and started using words instead. Extreme, dangerous, unprecedented. Snowfall rates climbed, and what fell wasn't light powder. It was dense, wet and heavy, the kind that settles fast and refuses to move. As the storm intensified, evacuation warnings became firmer. Emergency vehicles moved door to door in some neighborhoods, urging anyone still inside to leave before access was cut off completely. Roof collapses were no longer isolated incidents. They were expected. Entire blocks went dark as power lines sagged under the load. Inside his house, Evan could hear it happening elsewhere. The dull thump of snow sliding, the sharp crack of beams failing in the distance. Each sound carried through the still air like a warning. Instead of packing, Evan kept working. He moved outside during brief breaks in the snowfall, tightening temporary braces, adjusting angles, adding layers where stress would travel. He wasn't adding strength so much as guiding pressure, giving the weight somewhere safe to go. Snow climbed higher around the walls, sealing gaps and blocking wind. The house began to disappear, its outlines softened until it looked less like a structure and more like a rise in the landscape. From the street, it was already hard to tell where the roof ended and the drifts began. By nightfall, the storm was fully in control. Visibility dropped to nothing. Wind pushed snow sideways, packing it into every surface it could find. Evan retreated inside and sealed the door, listening as the house changed its relationship with the storm. There were no sharp cracks, no sudden shifts, just the steady, controlled sound of snow moving the way it was meant to, sliding, settling, redistributing itself. Inside, the temperature held. Without constant exposure to wind, the walls stayed warmer than expected. The snow outside, thick and unmoving, acted as a barrier instead of a threat. Across Valdez, other homes weren't as quiet. Crews responded to collapses as long as they could, then stopped when it became too dangerous to move. Sirens faded. The town went still. In that silence, Evan sat at his table, lamp burning low, feeling the house carry the weight of the storm exactly the way he had hoped it would. By the time morning came, if morning could still be called that, Valdez was buried deeper than ever. And Evan's house, reshaped by snow and pressure, was still standing. By the fourth day, Valdez no longer looked like a town. It looked like terrain. Houses blended into the drifts. Their shapes softened until only chimneys and the tops of second-story windows hinted that people had ever lived there. Snow lay 10, 12, sometimes 15 feet deep in places, compressed by wind into dense layers that felt more like earth than powder. Movement stopped. Emergency crews were grounded. Roads vanished completely. The storm didn't roar anymore. It pressed, steady and relentless, adding weight where weight was least forgiving. Inside Evan Holt's house, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of abandonment or fear. It was controlled. The snow that buried the walls and roof cut off wind entirely, sealing the structure in place. Where other homes had been exposed to constant pressure and shifting loads, Evan's house had become part of the landscape itself. Snow didn't fight the roof. It followed it. Instead of collecting in dangerous slabs, it slid down angled surfaces and settled evenly along reinforced sections, distributing weight the way he had planned. He moved slowly through the house, checking points of stress by touch rather than sight. Beams felt solid, walls didn't flex. The familiar creaks people fear in heavy snow never came. Inside, the temperature remained stable, warmer than expected, protected from the wind by layers of packed snow acting as insulation. Power flickered once, then went out for good. Evan lit lamps and adjusted his routine without panic. He had expected this. The house wasn't relying on systems anymore. It was relying on shape. Outside, other structures failed quietly. Not with dramatic collapses, but with slow sags that turned into sudden drops. Crews would later find roofs folded inward under loads they were never designed to carry. In contrast, Evan's house absorbed the storm. Snow continued to pile higher, partially burying windows, swallowing doors, turning the building into a low, smooth mound. To someone passing overhead, if anyone could have, it would have looked abandoned, maybe already lost. That night, as the storm finally began to ease, Evan sat listening to the last of the snow slide away from critical points, shedding itself in heavy, controlled sheets. There was no moment of victory, no relief yet, only confirmation. The house had done exactly what it was meant to do. While Valdez waited for the snow to stop and the damage to reveal itself, Evan waited too, inside a structure that had learned to survive by becoming part of the storm instead of resisting it. The storm didn't end with noise, it ended with absence. When Evan Holt opened his door that morning, the world outside felt unnaturally still, as if Valdez were holding its breath. The snowfall had stopped, but the weight remained. Snow lay everywhere, on roofs, over cars, across streets that no longer existed. In some places, the drifts were higher than the first floors of buildings. What had once been neighborhoods were now smooth, white fields broken only by the tops of poles and the occasional roofline that had survived the night. Evan climbed onto what used to be his front yard and looked around. His house was still there, but changed. Snow wrapped around it tightly, reshaped by gravity and wind, into a form that barely resembled the structure beneath. Sections of the roof were completely buried. Other areas were clean, snow having slid away exactly as he'd intended. The walls hadn't bowed. Nothing had collapsed. The house stood quiet and solid, not untouched but unbroken. As access slowly returned, crews began moving through the town, marking damage and checking for anyone who might still be trapped. They found homes crushed under loads no one could have predicted months earlier, roofs folded inward, walls pushed apart by snow that had nowhere to go. When they reached Evans Street, they stopped. His house didn't fit the pattern. It wasn't cleared, and it wasn't destroyed. It looked like something that had been shaped by the storm rather than beaten by it. Inspectors asked questions. How had he kept the roof from collapsing? Why hadn't he cleared more snow? Evan didn't offer a long explanation. He showed them the angles, the reinforcements, the way snow had been allowed to settle instead of fight back. He explained that weight only becomes dangerous when it concentrates in the wrong places. Spread out, guided and supported, it could be carried. By the time officials lifted evacuation warnings, the story had already moved on to recovery, clearing roads, reopening schools, counting costs. Evan returned to normal routines quietly. He didn't rebuild the house back to how it had been before. He left many of the changes in place. Valdez would forget the lessons soon enough, as towns often do once the snow melts. But that winter had proven something simple and unsettling. In places where nature doesn't stop, survival belongs to those who build with it, not against it. When spring finally reached Valdez, it did not arrive suddenly. It came in slow signs, the sound of water running beneath snowbanks, the first dark patches of ground appearing where the sun lingered longest, the heavy weight on roofs easing day by day. As the town dug itself out and repairs began, the winter of 2007 was already being spoken about as something people were glad to leave behind. Damaged homes were fixed or torn down. Emergency costs were calculated. Life moved forward, as it always does. Evan Holt's house remained much as it had been during the storm. He removed temporary supports, but he kept the shape. The steeper rooflines stayed. The load paths remained reinforced. Snow-shedding surfaces became permanent. He didn't do it to make a statement or to prepare for attention. He did it because the house had taught him something in real time, that survival in extreme environments isn't about resisting force, but about guiding it until it has nowhere harmful to go. City inspectors noted the changes, but didn't rewrite building codes. Neighbors noticed too, though mostly in passing. A few asked questions the following winter, curious about angles and snow behavior. Most went back to clearing roofs the way they always had. Memory fades quickly once danger does, but the evidence remained, quiet and unremarkable, a house that had been buried, reshaped, and tested under more snow than most people will ever experience. Years later, the winter of 2007 would still come up in conversation, usually as a story about how much snow fell and how close Valdez came to being shut down completely. Evan's name surfaced occasionally, attached to a simple idea. The man who stayed when others left. He never claimed he was right to do so. He only knew that when evacuation wasn't an option for everyone, understanding the environment could mean the difference between collapse and survival. The snow eventually melted. It always does. But what that winter revealed didn't disappear with it. In places where nature applies pressure without warning, the safest structures are not always the strongest-looking ones. They are the ones shaped with humility, built to accept what cannot be stopped, and quiet enough to endure until the storm decides it has taken all it can.